very much. As probably a lot of you know, I lived in North Wales for 20 years, so in a way coming back to Wales is like coming home in a way. It's a nice change from London, although at the moment that seems to be where my work is. As Bob has said, I'm very interested in Theosophy. In fact, I go farther and say I'm interested. It is my whole life. I'm involved in it virtually every day of the week. I run the bookshop, I'm involved with the Society in London, and I do enjoy coming out and lecturing as well. This evening, though, I gather I'm talking about astrology and Theosophy. It's a fascinating subject, this. I mean, one could talk about astrology on its own for the whole evening. One could talk about astrology for years, actually, and still not come to the end of it. But what I want to talk about this evening is the connection between astrology and Theosophy and the contributions that they have made to each other, because I feel that Theosophy has made tremendous contributions to astrology and vice versa. It's not an unusual subject really to be talking about, because if we look at the second object of the Theosophical Society, we see that the second object says it's to encourage the study of comparative religions, philosophies and science. Well, I consider astrology to be a science, one that we need to study and understand. But having said that, as well as being a science, it's also an art, and I think we have to combine the two. The science comes in with the mathematics of astrology, and one needs to know those extremely well, and they can be very, very complicated. Luckily today, with the age of computers, it's very much easier than it was in the past, but one still does need a knowledge of mathematics, and one needs to be a real student of astrology to have a good understanding of astronomy as well. We need to know how the solar system actually works and functions. But it's also an art, and the art, I think, lies in the interpretation. No matter how good you are on the scientific side, unless you have some gift of intuition, some art, some feeling for it, you'll never make an astrologer. You can look at the pure symbolism on a birth chart, a natal chart, but unless you have some gift, some art, you'll never be able to interpret it accurately. So I consider that it's well within the scope of our second object to encourage the study of this science and art. Now, what is astrology? This is a wide thing. A lot of people are still under the impression it's the thing that we see in the popular papers. Today's reading for a Cancerian, don't travel today, it's going to be foggy or something, and I say like I'm a Cancerian. But this is a lot of people's views of astrology, that they don't go much farther than the newspapers and popular magazines. In some ways, it is part of astrology, but it's only skimming the surface. If we think that there are 12 sun signs, and the population must be divided amongst those, there must be literally millions of Cancerians in the earth at this moment. We can't all be facing the same problems and difficulties at the same time, or have the same feelings even. So that type of popular astrology is just skimming the surface. So what have we got in astrology? We've got three different things, actually, three different branches of astrology, and I think I'll mention those first. First one we call natal astrology, which is the life and characteristics of a person, an individual. The positive and negative forces that were present at their birth and that can form an influence in them during their lives. Now, having said that, in no way do I consider astrology fatalistic. Because those forces and influences are there at birth doesn't mean to say you just accept them and say, I'm not going to do anything about this. I am a Cancerian, therefore there is nothing I can do about it. We are given these influences, these forces at birth, so that we can make something of our lives with them. And I think this is where, on a personal level, astrology can be extremely useful. Because if you are aware of your own strengths and weaknesses, and know that for some karmic reason they were there at your birth, you can do something positive about them, using your positive qualities to overcome your negative ones, to bring a balance into your life. So in that sense, having a natal chart, pointing out your characteristics and your potentials for the present and the future, can be a very, very useful tool in anyone's life, in our spiritual development particularly. But there's another fields of astrology apart from this one. There is what we call mundane astrology, And at our present time, I consider this to be an absolutely fascinating area. Mundane astrology deals with world trends, the destiny of nations, the astrology of groups rather than of individuals. And with the upheavals that are taking place on our planet at the moment, I think mundane astrology is an extremely useful tool to understand what is happening and why it is happening. We can't necessarily alter what is happening, but we can understand through astrology why it is happening. And if we know why things are happening, then perhaps our attitude towards what is happening in the world at the moment can change. We can not apportion blame in the way that we tend to do without knowing perhaps the astrological reasons as to why events are taking place. It puts things in a very different perspective for us. And there again, I think astrology can be extremely useful. The third system of astrology, one that isn't used so much these days, but again is extremely fascinating, is called horary astrology. And this is obtaining the answers to questions, using astrology as a means of obtaining an answer. It's a very difficult form of astrology, and one needs a new set of disciplines to understand it. If one is just accustomed to working with natal charts or mundane astrology, you would fall very much adrift if you then launch straight into horary astrology. The rules are very, very different. But under the right circumstances and with the right interpretation, and this is where the art comes in, it can give amazingly accurate answers to questions. Having said that, there are certain rules that must be applied. First of all, the question has to be extremely precise. It won't answer waffly, vague questions. It has to be a very precise question. And a chart has to be constructed for the precise moment that the question was thought of. And this is difficult, because we're not always quite sure when we actually think about a question. And if we do think about a question, we want an answer, do we actually note down the time that we thought of it? So there is this difficulty that is implicit in horary astrology. But in the past, particularly during the time of the Civil War, for example, horary astrology was used by a British astrologer, William Lilly, extremely effectively. I don't know whether he believed in itself, because he worked for both sides, both the parliamentarians and the royalists, but he gave extremely accurate predictions to both sides using this art of horary astrology, and produced one of the standard textbooks on this subject, which is still in print today, called Christian Astrology. Fascinating work, because it actually shows you the questions that he was asked and the answers that he arrived at, and now looking back over history we can see how accurate he was with some of the answers. Amazingly accurate. So it makes me believe that if the circumstances are right, this method of astrology can be very, very useful tool indeed. But it has fallen into disuse over the last 50 years at least. But there is a revival of it again at the moment. The Astrological Lodge in London, for example, is very interested in it, and they do run quite serious courses on it. Let's have a look at the history of astrology, because we know how it stands at the moment, but has it got a history that supports some of the things that we feel about it at the moment? I think most certainly it does. Of all the arts and sciences, occult arts and sciences particularly, probably astrology is the oldest. We can go back to 15,000 years BC, when there has been discovered animal bones with markings on them which actually signify the lunar phases. So it suggests that at least 15,000 years BC, men were aware that planetary and lunar forces had some influence on their lives. And I think this is quite remarkable, you know, that we imagine that our ancestors were quite primitive, and in some ways I think they were probably far more advanced than we were. They were picking up these natural energies much easier, without the complications that civilization place upon us, and perhaps they were much more in tune with these natural forces than we give them credit for. But certainly 15,000 years BC they were aware of them. Astrology really, I think, started to come into its own somewhere between 4 and 2000 BC, when we saw the growth of the megalithic monuments in northwestern Europe and the pyramids in Egypt. And I think there's enough evidence available today to suggest that these sacred sites, as I would certainly like to call them, were constructed on quite accurate astrological and astronomical principles. I don't think there's any doubt about this. We know this is true with Stonehenge. I think the same thing applies to the pyramids and probably Avebury and a large number of sites, that people were aware of the movement of the stars, the planets, and maybe even of the Earth's rotation. So astrology and astronomy, and don't forget in those days it was the same thing, we hadn't a split between astrology and astronomy as we have today. They were aware of these influences and were trying to tune in their sacred sites with these lines of energy, these forces. I think they played a much more important part in the daily life of people then than they do today. Or perhaps though with our daily papers it still does play an important part in our lives. Who knows how many people are influenced by them. The first real records we've got of astrological calculations come from Babylon, again about 2000 years BC. There a lot of serious work was done. The kind of calculations and results that they were achieving are not dissimilar from what's going on today. They were very advanced, and they were very aware of most of the inner planets. They may be not aware of the outer, but certainly were aware of the inner planets and their movements. It then moved on quite rapidly. I know we're going over vast time scales here, but astrology did move very rapidly, and it was well known in Greece from the period 800 to 1000 years BC. It was very well known in Rome up to 500 BC, AD rather. We've gone into the next cycle now. The Romans and the Greeks used it, were aware of it. Again, it was an everyday part of their lives. It was quite an honoured profession to be an astrologer in those days. You weren't considered a bit strange, a bit freaky, a bit way out then. It was, it was an honoured profession. Most rulers, statesmen, military generals would employ an astrologer before they made any serious decisions. Very important part of our lives. Perhaps we need it again today. We might not make so many mistakes if we perhaps relied on it a little more. One of the greatest influences on modern astrology came from the Islamic expansion. No doubt about this. When they spread through North Africa and into Spain, they brought Islamic astrology with them, and it was extremely advanced. This was in the period from 600 to 1400 AD. It reached its height in Spain. Spain, as I've been talking about earlier today about the Kabbalah, was a European melting pot. We had Islamic influence coming over from North Africa. We had a Christian influence coming down from Northern Europe. We had a very strong Jewish population. In that kind of climate, astrology flourished, and flourished extremely well. Other influences were brought in. The tarot was brought in. Kabbalah was brought in. Astrology started to mature and become more than just a method of prediction. I think it moved into the state of being a science then. Up until then, it had been basically predictions, whether it was the right day to do this and whether the right thing would happen if you did that. With this melting pot that took place in Spain, we actually saw astrology developing into the kind of art and science that we know it today. Now, I think we must never underrate the influence that Islam has actually played on Western astrology. We seem to think that it's a very Western thing, but it isn't really, because if we go to the Indian subcontinent, for instance, we find there's a school of astrology there that is very different to our Western one, but again is incredibly accurate, and in some ways more accurate than ours. I have a friend who is a Hindu astrologer, and when I first met him, he knew very little about me at all. I think about all he knew about me was my name, nothing more. And we were chatting one day in London, and he said, I'd like to do a chart for you. He said, tell me when you were born. So I told him my birthday, didn't want anything else, and he got the back of an envelope, and I don't know whether you've seen Hindu astrology, but they do it in a square, divided into triangles. And he drew it on the back of an envelope, and he filled in a few figures and did some calculations down the side. And he told me incidents in my life and the year that they would happen, which was unbelievably accurate. He could tell me the month that major occurrences had happened in my life, right from childhood. I was quite amazed by it. And he said, this is an everyday practice in India. He said, we all do it. He said, there's nothing special about it at all. And it quite staggered me, because it was one of the best readings I've ever had in my life. And he did this in about 10 minutes on the back of an envelope. So what he was doing, if he'd do it seriously for somebody, I don't really know. But it was quite staggering. So we have this Eastern school of astrology, which is extremely valuable, and we perhaps should pay more attention to it. But coming back to the Islamic one, I had a very interesting experience of that. Just about a year ago now, I went to Morocco for a holiday, and I hired a car with a friend, and we went down into the edge of the Sahara Desert. We came to the last town before you hit the Sahara Desert, and there was a library there. And we thought, well, we'll go and have a look at this. There was this sign up saying library and that. So we went and had a look. And obviously nobody had been there for some time, but we found the caretaker and he took us in. And he was very pleased to have something to look round it. And it was made up of scrolls and books in parchment on various skins. And they had subjects on homeopathy and science and mathematics and obviously a lot on the Quran. But they had a large section devoted to astrology. And they had the charts there drawn out. And these manuscripts went back to the 11th and 12th century, and they were preserved. Now, I can't read Arabic, and I would make no pretense to be able to read it, but I could read the charts. There was no difficulty at all. It was like looking at a modern chart. They were as well drawn and as accurate as any chart I've seen now. And if I'd got them out and sat down, I could have read them and told people what was happening at that time. It was quite an eye-opener, really, to look at things that were coming from the 11th and 12th century, and I realised what a debt we owed to Islamic astrology for that. They obviously brought that method over into Spain, and we took it up from there. Very, very interesting indeed. Of course, then, Renaissance Europe took to it like a duck takes to water. They couldn't believe this. Here we've got some method of prediction, interpretation, character analysis, which seems to work. And it moved away from the Islamic influence into the Western Europe Christian influence. And again, major breakthroughs came. Very major breakthroughs indeed. As probably most of you who are interested in astrology know, one of the most contentious issues is the question of house division. We know that we have 12 signs of the zodiac running around from Aries right the way around again to Pisces, and that they, to a certain degree, give us our basic characteristics, certainly our spiritual characteristics, if not our physical ones. But there is another form of division of the solar sky. It's called the houses. And there's been a lot of debate for a long time as to how these houses, how the sky, how the natal chart should be divided. Actually, there's one there on the board. If you imagine that's the birth chart, the figures running around it from 1 to 12 represent the 12 houses. Now, these houses represent areas of our life, our mundane life, our health, our career, our relationships, all this type of thing, right? How that actually astrological influences affect us in our mundane life, not in our characteristic, but how we actually function in the world. That is what we call an equal house system, where the sky is divided up into 12 segments of 30 degrees each. But there are many, many other systems of dividing the sky up. They all depend on the exact moment of your birth and place of birth. We have that in common. It's called the ascendant or rising sign, and it can set your outer personality, your persona, the way you project yourself into the world, the way other people perceive you and react to you. Very different sometimes from your sun sign. Based on that, which is called the first house, the first line coming across, the other 12 divisions work out. We owe it to the Renaissance philosophers, magicians, occultists, whatever one likes to call them, for developing various house systems which can be used for different types of charts. First of all, we had Copernicus in 1297. He brought a house system based on the ascendant. Quite a complicated one, but it's still in use today by some people, not very many, but it's still used by a few astrologers. Then in 1436 we had Rigor Mortanus, who brought out a different system, not all that different, but a slightly different way of working it out, still used by a few people today. Then we had an interesting breakthrough. In 1503 we had one of the perhaps more famous astrologers. We had Nostradamus come on the scene, who made tremendous predictions, which some people are still trying to interpret today, and some people will consider are very relevant to what's happening in the world today. But his predictions are extremely difficult to interpret. But there's no doubt he was an extremely accomplished astrologer. We follow him in 1527 by the first of the famous British astrologers, a well-known magician, spy, entrepreneur named Dr. John Dee. He was the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth at one point, and then fell out of favour and fell back in again. Did a lot of work on ceremonial magic, devised his own system of magic, but also, again, was an extremely accomplished astrologer, and some of his works on astrology are a very interesting reading. He was followed then by somebody I've already mentioned in 1602, William Lilly. Fascinating, not only for his work on horary astrology during the Civil War, which alone would set him aside as a major influence on Western astrology, but he did something which is still with us today. He produced the first almanacs for public sale. He brought them out sort of penny sheets, giving your sun sign for the month or for the year, and these were widely circulated during the 17th century. And I think these were the forerunners of what we see in our daily papers, and apparently he was extremely successful at it. We owe a lot to William Lilly. He was a brilliant man, even though he did change sides quite a bit during the Civil War. I think we can let him off with that one. Then the influence again was back in Europe again with another new house system, Placidus. One that's probably used more than anything else today. Was brought out somewhere about 1603, and a large number of astrologers use that system today. It has its failings, and I think most astrologers are aware of these failings, that it doesn't work if you get into highly northern latitudes. It works for where we are at the moment in Western Europe, but if we start getting into Norway and Sweden and further north, then the system tends to break down, I'm afraid. But it is very useful for horary astrology, and you'll find that most people who study horary astrology end up using the Placidus system. It's much better than the equal house for that, though my own personal view is that the equal house is probably better for natal astrology. So I think one needs to know both of these systems, and again we owe this man a debt of gratitude. Then, of course, the influence swung back to England again. It's interesting how the movement in astrology swung from Britain to the continent and back again, as if the flow of ideas was going backwards and forwards during this period. It must have been a very exciting time, because we had Raphael in England in the 1800s, who brought out the famous ephemerises that most people used until the advent of computers. And again, it was a major breakthrough because it meant that more and more people could do astrology quicker. There were tables giving you the position of the planets at various times of the year. Major breakthrough. It saved hours and hours and hours of laborious mathematics that the earlier astrologers had to do. Then, of course, in 1875, we had another, what I would consider, breakthrough in astrology. We had the foundation of the Theosophical Society. Now, a lot of people would say, well, what has this got to do with astrology? It's something completely different. But I say that the Theosophical Society and astrology are very strongly interwoven. You can't separate the two. Any of you who have read any of Madame Blavatsky's works know that she refers to astrology quite frequently in there. She was very aware of it herself. But she didn't practice it. And I don't think many early members of the Theosophical Society actually practiced astrology themselves. They were aware of it, but they weren't necessarily astrologers. We had to wait until a little bit further on, and then we find that astrology and theosophy really did work hand in glove. But before we get to that situation, let's have a look briefly at some of the things that the Theosophical teachings actually have to say about astrology, to see if the remarks I'm making actually do hold water or not. First of all, we would look, or I would suggest that you looked at a small pamphlet put out by a Commander R. Bowen called How to Study the Secret Doctrine. It's a very interesting little pamphlet, and it's basically instructions to students as to how to handle this rather difficult work. But he lays down one or two ideas there that I think fit in with my ideas of what astrology is about. First of all, he says, and these are principles that we should grasp and hold in our minds the whole time: the fundamental unity of all existence. Well, if we can hold that idea in our heads, we must accept that the influence of the planets is a viable option in our lives. Likewise, we could also influence the planets, because if there is a unity of all existence, the influences must go both ways. And I think there's a lovely quote, I don't know whether it's from Blake or not, where it says that the furthest planet feels our every tear. And I think this is very true, in fact. We must realise that we are all interdependent on each other. Then he says another fundamental idea here that to me makes a lot of sense in the astrological world. There is no dead matter. Everything in the universe is alive in some form or another. That suggests to me very strongly that the planets have a life or a force of their own which can influence us. How it influences us I wouldn't like to speculate on tonight. It's a deep subject, and I'm sure we all have our different views as to how these planetary forces, if they exist, influence us. But if we accept this premise that there is no dead matter, then we must accept that they must influence us in some way or other. Every life form must influence another one in some form or another. Then he says man is the microcosm. This goes back to a very old Kabbalistic idea, which he then goes on to elaborate, that as above, so it is below. There is but one life and one law. So, what is happening up in the sky is a reflection of what's happening in us. And what's happening in us is a reflection of what's happening up in the sky. We can't separate the two out. So we can look at this both ways. We can study ourselves and say this is obviously a reflection of what's happening in the universe. The turmoils, the difficulties, the forces that are working within me are a reflection of what is working out in the universe. And also one can look out at the universe and look at the planetary positions and the interplay between them and say these forces are influencing me. It's a two-way process. And I think these are the grounds that I would say astrology works on. We influence the planets influence us. But then also HPB herself had one or two things to say which I think again strengthen the case for astrology. In The Secret Doctrine, in Volume 1, Part 1, she says, everything in the universe throughout all its kingdoms is conscious. Well, that's quite a staggering thought, really. The more I meditate and think about this, the more staggering it becomes. Everything in the universe throughout all its kingdoms is conscious. It might not be the kind of consciousness that we can perceive, but it does suggest that everything, even this table, has a form of consciousness of its own, which is valid to it. Likewise, the astrological bodies must have a consciousness of their own, which could possibly affect us. Then she goes on again in The Secret Doctrine to say, and I think this is a very, very important point she makes. She says, the radical unity of the essential essence of each constituent part of a compound in nature, from star to mineral atom, this unity is the one fundamental law in occult science. If we actually believe what HPB wrote in The Secret Doctrine, we have no option but to accept that astrology works. He's actually stating it there. This unity is the one fundamental law in occult science. It is a unity. We do affect each other. And it's no good all the scientists trying to poo-poo the idea and say no, there is no grounds for evidence. I go along with the words of HPB and say yes, there is a fundamental unity in the universe, from mineral atom to star and vice versa. And on that I would say my belief in astrology really stands. She doesn't make many direct references to astrology itself in the SD, but in her collected writings in volume 12 she does. There's a diagram there on page 532, I'd like to look it up. And she shows there some correspondences between the 7 principles of man and the heavenly bodies. And I found this was quite fascinating, and I'll just read you out what she had to say about them. She said that Atma corresponded to no visible planet. Now, I think that's quite a fascinating idea. It corresponds to no visible planet. So it's suggesting there to me very strongly she's referring to a planet on a different level of existence, but it's still there. Very fascinating idea. Some of the others are quite easy to understand. She says the sun corresponds to prana, or the life force. That to me makes a lot of sense. I can understand. We look up to the sun and we know that that's our life force. We need the sun. This planet needs the sun. We know that that is in some ways symbolising our life force. She says the moon corresponds to the astral body of man. That again makes sense to me, because in astrological terms sometimes the moon represents the hidden side of things, the deeper side of our subconscious or unconscious, our emotions, all sorts of nubious areas of our life the moon can represent. So it could well correspond to our astral body. Mercury, she says, represents Buddhi, or the spiritual soul. That I find harder to understand, and I haven't really come to terms with it, but these are HPP's own words. And she says Venus represents Manas, the higher mind. Yes, that I can understand, yes, because Venus is a planet of beauty, of intelligence, a kind, pleasant planet. Mars, this one I can understand, represents Kama Rupa, or the animal instincts. And I think most of us who know the Mars influence, the Mars force at its worst, would say it represented the animal side of human nature. I think there's a lot of it loose in the world at the moment. Jupiter, quite fascinating. Here she says it corresponds to the auric envelope, a term that she doesn't use in the Secret Doctrine, but uses in her collected writings. That, again, I think needs a lot of thought and meditation. I haven't really come to terms with Jupiter and the auric envelope at the moment. And then Saturn, Karma Manas, the lower mind. That I could accept, because to me Saturn represents disciplines, restraints, obstacles to be overcome in one's life. And these are the obstacles of our own lower mind, our own concrete mind. We do create our own obstacles most of the time. So I think Saturn could well be linked in with our lower mind and the restrictions we place upon ourselves rather than other people placing them upon us. So that's what theoretical Theosophy has to say about it from the writings of HPB. But now let's see how, as I said earlier, astrology and theosophy became so interwoven. And it's really down to the work of 2 men, 2 British theosophists. Very well-known names in astrological worlds, but maybe not quite so well-known in theosophical world. Alan Leo and Charles Carter. I think 2 men that have made more impact on Western astrology than anybody else that I've mentioned so far. Alan Leo was born Frederick William Allen on the 7th of August 1860, with Leo as his rising sign. Good old Victorian thing here to accept a pseudonym, Alan Leo. And he was an astrologer, no doubt about it. But he's also a theosophist, and a very dedicated theosophist. In 1890 he met Walter Old, quite a well-known theosophist of that period. He wrote the preface to Gems from the East, close colleague of Madame Blavatsky's. Well, Old took Alan Leo along to 19 Avenue Road, where he met HPB and joined the Theosophical Society. So we have a direct link here to HPB, which I think is fascinating. She obviously didn't disapprove of astrology at all. She accepted him as a member. And he went on, and he met Olcott and Judge as well, and become well known with the founder members of the society, and went on to form his own lodge in Brixton. So he's actually the president of his own lodge. And it was opened by Mead, so he was well in with the early Theosophists. On the opening ceremony, Mead was present, and he was an active member of the Theosophical Society for 27 years. So we can see that he was quite a dedicated Theosophist, but he is better known in the world, I'm afraid, as an astrologer. He wrote many, many books on astrology. All of them I could recommend to you as standard works on astrology and well worth reading. He wrote Practical Astrology, Astrology for All, Casting the Horoscope, How to Judge a Nativity, The Art of Synthesis, The Progressed Horoscope, The Key to Your Own Nativity, Esoteric Astrology. He edited a magazine called Modern Astrologer, and he wrote pocket manuals on all types of astrology. But perhaps his best known and most interesting work as far as we're concerned is Esoteric Astrology, because here he combines astrology and theosophy in one work. And as far as I know at the moment, it's probably the only work that does this very satisfactorily. It's quite an amazing book. It's a difficult book, both theosophically and astrologically, to read. It's not an easy one. It's a bit like the SD, you have to work at it a bit. But he does make some quite interesting statements in it. One thing he does, he lays the emphasis on the possibility of intuitive astrologers, and he stresses this word, which comes into this idea of the art again, the intuitive astrologer being able to discover deeper interpretation by meditating upon the symbolism of the various example horoscopes. So one is taking it a stage further here. We're using the chart as a basis for meditation. We're not just looking at it in the scientific way and saying, yes, Sun in Cancer, Moon in Virgo, this type of thing. We're actually meditating upon this symbolism and going to a much deeper depth of understanding. And I think that we need to develop that approach if we are going to be successful astrologers. He also gave a general interpretation of theosophical teachings in the light of astrology about the nature and purpose of human incarnation. And I think this was a great gift he gave us, because we all wonder, I'm sure every one of us at times think, why am I here? What's the purpose of this? And he tries to lay down a purpose in his book, Esoteric Astrology. It can help the student to approach his studies with much more understanding than he would have done otherwise. We see that there was a purpose in our time and place of birth. Now, I don't know whether you're like me, but sometimes I've looked at my parents and my upbringing and my home and thought, why was I born here at this time with these people? And that thought, particularly when I was younger, went through my mind quite often. But now I can see that was a very strong astrological reason why I should have been born at that place at that time with those parents. And it's the kind of works that Alan Leo puts over that makes it easier to understand this, that there is a purpose in our lives, even if at times we can't see it. The purpose is still there. And I think this is where Theosophy particularly can help us to see a much more overview of our own lives than we do normally. We tend to see it very much on a day-to-day basis of thinking, why is this happening to me now? What Alan Leo is trying to put over in Esoteric Philosophy is that there is a pattern to our life, and it is obvious from our birth charts if we can interpret them in the right way. He's an amazing man. He also had a very powerful wife called Bessie Leo, who gave him a tremendous amount of support, and she also was a very prominent theosophist, and they actually met in a theosophical lodge, I think in Bournemouth or Southampton. I made a note of it somewhere, but they got together. Yes, in Southampton. She read about him in an astrological magazine, saw that he was speaking at the Southampton lodge, went along to hear him, and they ended up getting married. It's a warning to keep clear of astrologers, I should think. But she was a strong support to him, and she wrote a very interesting book about his life, where I managed to glean a lot of these facts about him. She gave him great support. And she wrote a very nice thing about him. She said, although Mr. Leo is best known to the world as an astrologer, He was before all else a theosophist. He could not think of theosophy as being complete without the great science of astrology, but equally he could not imagine astrology without theosophy. And I think that's probably a finer tribute you could pay to that man than anything else. He brought those two sciences together and said to people, they are the same. There is no difference here. We might call one theosophy and one astrology, but in fact they are two facets of the same thing. He was a marvellous man. His wife carried on after him, and one of the things that they did set up between them was the Astrological Lodge of the Theosophical Society. It's had a very checkered history. Like most things in the Theosophical Society, it hasn't necessarily run smoothly, but it's still in existence. It's had its splits, and the splits have split, and the splits have split again, but there is still, but at the moment it's known as the Astrological Lodge of London. It does still trace its roots back to Alan Leo, and they're doing and carrying on his same work. Although they are now independent of the Theosophical Society, they do acknowledge that that's where they started from. There has been an attempt in London to revive the Astrological Lodge of the Theosophical Society again, but it's meeting a lot of difficulties. It's interesting how these cycles repeat themselves. One of the main causes for the original split was the introduction into the lodge of non-theosophical members, and then they became members of the committee of the lodge. So at one point you had a lodge made up of non-theosophical members, and so a split came then. We now have a revival of the Theosophical Lodge of the Astrological Lodge of the Theosophical Society, and again they want to open it to non-theosophists and allow them to sit on the committee. It's completing the cycle again. We're going to go through it once again. It's quite tragic in a way, but perhaps that's part of our karma. I don't know. It's interesting to speculate upon. Anyway, he carried on this good work, and he didn't eventually die until 1917. He led a very active, and he was working for astrology and theosophy right up until his death. His place was then taken in the Astrological Lodge by the next theosophist who made a great impact on the Western world, Charles Carter. Now, I'm very proud of Charles Carter because his books are still in print. We, the Theosophical Society, published most of them in the first place, and we still publish most of them today. He went into decline. A lot of astrologers thought he was old-fashioned and old hat and wasn't worth bothering with, and nobody bought his books. But suddenly he's come back into favour again, and his books are selling extremely well. One book in particular, called Astrological Aspects, is, in my opinion, one of the finest books written on aspects that's ever come out. It's out of print at the moment, but it's in great demand. It really is. It's a fascinating work. He was president of the Astrological Lodge from 1922 to 1952, 30 years as president of it, and 30 years as an active theosophist, and again brought out a tremendous number of books. I must admire these men on the amount of writing they did, because not only were they active astrologers, but they found time to do all this writing as well, which is quite remarkable. I admire their energy and drive to be able to do it. I don't think I could. He brought out, first of all, well no, they're not in sequences, he brought out Astrological Aspects, probably his best known book. But another one which came out in 1932 is called The Astrology of Accidents. And this is very interesting reading, because he suggests that there are no things as accidents as we know them, that everything is actually predictable. And he draws on a tremendous number of case histories to illustrate his point. It's a fascinating reading then. Then he brings out his Encyclopedia of Psychological Astrology, which again suggests that there is an astrological cause to most illness and diseases. Again, quite fascinating reading. An interesting work, the last work he brought out in 1947, was Essays on the Foundations of Astrology, a very sound test book on astrological ideas. An Introduction to Political Astrology, which deals with this mundane astrology that I was talking about, the movement of world powers, institutions and organisations. Principles of Astrology, The 7 Great Problems of Astrology, symbolic directions in modern astrology, which is all to do with timing, and what's one of the hardest things in astrology also, as it is any form of prediction, is timing. And here he lays down a lot of very clear directions on the idea of timing in astrology. And then an interesting work, which is in great demand at the moment, Zodiac and the Soul. Fascinating book. To him, and this is one of his quotes, he said, "To the astrologer, the zodiac is a real thing. Even if he cannot see it or feel it in the physical sense, he knows that its construction is no arbitrary matter, but is derived from real principles of the utmost importance." He had no doubt about it at all. Goes back to these original teachings that I said of HPB, of the unity of one. He knew that it was all one. He knew it existed. He had no doubt about it. And that kind of confidence comes through his writings. I think it's absolutely amazing. But now let's have a look at what's happening in the present. As I say, we have the astrological lodges still in existence in London, and they keep popping up quite regularly. I don't know whether it's the same in Cardiff, but in London we've got about, I should think, half a dozen astrological groups at the moment, and they all say that they are the direct descendants of Alan Leo. I don't know which one really is, but they all claim it, and they're all doing good work in their own right, so I wouldn't knock any of them at all. I mean, they're all doing different aspects. Astrology branches in many directions. Some are very interested in the psychological aspect of it, the makeup of us and how we function. Others are interested in the predictive side of it. Can we answer questions accurately? Others, and a lot of them at the moment, are interested in mundane astrology and the movement of world events. And I'd just like to close in talking about those, because I think this is of great importance. As we're all probably aware, the world is going through a time of great upheaval again. I suppose every generation says this in one way or another, that this is a time of great upheaval, but it is. What we've seen happen to the world over the last 3 years has been quite amazing. It started back in 1989. For those of you who know about astrology, there were major conjunctions taking place then in the sign Capricorn. And traditionally, Capricorn is the sign that rules the Earth. It's the astrological sign most linked to the Earth. And we had major conjunctions taking place there during 1989. We had Saturn conjoined Neptune in Capricorn 3 times that year, and very precise conjunctions. The 2 planets were exactly lined up when viewed from the Earth. That influence on the Earth was going to do 2 things. Saturn represents restrictions, restraints and disciplines. Neptune, and the other planet that was involved in this to a lesser degree, Uranus, Uranus represents this desire for personal freedoms, to break away from convention, to break away from the old, to throw the old overboard, where Neptune deals with this spiritual aspirations of our lives. If you see those 3 planets working together, you've got a desire to break away from restraints and restrictions, to develop the spiritual side of one's nature, and to change the status quo, to turn things upside down. There had to be, during 1989, major political and social upheavals. It was almost unavoidable. With those influences so strongly on the Earth, they should happen. And one of the major conjunctions coincided with the night that the Berlin Wall came down. I think this is no chance, no coincidence. I think it had to happen that night. There was no alternative. There had to be a breaking away of the old restraints. Now obviously when we do that, we're going to get a counter-reaction to it, and we're seeing it at the moment. There is a counter-reaction. But I say, and I say this without any fear of contradiction, that the astrological forces working for change at the moment are so strong that nothing can stop them now. No matter how strong the situation deteriorates in the Gulf or anywhere else, and there will be upheavals, no change comes easily. We all know that through our Theosophical teachings, that no changes in the world come easily, and there's always a lot of pain and suffering involved. But the force, the flow of energy that is taking place in the world at the moment cannot be stopped. These changes are going to go through, and we're going to see by the year 2000 a completely different world. There is no doubt about that. I'm completely confident about this. So I'd say, okay, look at the television, read the papers, see the gloom and despondency and fear that is being spread around, but know in your heart that these changes are inevitable, and we are going to see the dawning of a new age, because the time is astrologically right for it, and nothing can stop it. Thank you all very much.